Today, I'm going to be speaking to Steve Hassan. Steve is a cult expert. That's actually his Twitter handle. It's cult expert. And he's one of the most widely recognized authorities on cults and mind control in the entire country. He has been studying these concepts for over 40 years. He himself was in a cult. He was recruited into the Moon cult. Have you ever heard of the Moonies? Okay, so that was the cult Steve was in. And after he left, he was just completely puzzled how someone like him could be recruited and believe all these things that he just never believed. And so he dedicated his life to trying to understand this and help other people out of cults and other destructive situations. You know, in this whole kind of umbrella of undue influence, you also have sex trafficking, you also have pimps, you also have multi-level marketing. It's a fascinating web of manipulation, and he's dedicated his life to studying so he can help other people out of it. As I said, widely respected human. You'll regularly see him on national TV. He's interviewed all the time. He was on MSNBC a few weeks ago. He was on Oprah's show back in the day. He does podcasts. He does TED Talks. He teaches an elective class at Harvard. He's a very, very smart individual. And I'm excited to bring you this interview. Last thing I'll say, you know, in 2016, he started noticing some alarming trends. You know, he had studied cult leaders like L. Ron Hubbard, David Koresh, Jim Jones, and he started seeing striking similarities to Donald Trump. And though he'd never been political and doesn't think of himself as political, he wrote a book about this. And he started talking about what he was seeing with the phenomenon of Trump. And more importantly, as we'll talk about in this episode, what are some techniques that we can use if our family member or if someone we really care about is kind of lost in this wormhole. So we talk about that, which I'm really excited to bring you because, you know, honestly, most of us do this wrong. You know, most of the time that we talk about Donald Trump, it ends in argument, and that further calcifies someone into their position. And so we don't want to do that, but I will give you all the answers with Steve today, and I'm excited to bring this interview. Okay, I am very, very honored to have my friend and a gentleman who I respect very much, Steve Hassan. So first things first, Steve, you just got your doctorate, correct?
Yes, I did at the tender age of 66.
Incredible. And we'll probably get into that a little bit today. But as I said in my intro, you know, I was familiar with Steve's work a long time ago. I got obsessed, like many people, with how crazy the cult of Scientology was. And you can't do any search of this content without coming across Steve's work. He's been seminal in this field for a very long time. But let's kind of start from your origin story. How did you get into this work?
Basically, I was a 19-year-old upper junior at Queens College. I was dumped by my girlfriend. I was a creative writing major, I should say. So I thought of myself as maybe being a professor one day and teaching English creative writing and writing books of poetry, etc. But my girlfriend dumped me. I was kind of low. The new semester was starting, and I was recruited into a friend group of the Moon cult. Sun Myung Moon was a billionaire from Korea who claimed to be the greatest man in human history, that Jesus asked him to finish Jesus's work on earth because Jesus was a failure. And I went from a conservative Jewish upbringing that was very anti-war in Vietnam, anti-Nixon, you know, like don't trust, you know, authority figures kind of mentality, to becoming a right-wing fascist with a three-piece suit and recruiting people into the Moon organization. Was promoted because I was kind of a good speaker to recruit other people. And then I got out because I fell asleep at the wheel of a van and almost died, and surfaced at my sister's house, and my family had been looking for me for over a year. And my father pounced with some ex-Mooney deprogrammers, took my crutches away and said, "We want to talk to you." Yeah. And I was so brainwashed, I was so fanatical that I looked at it as Satan trying to test me. And of course I was going to succeed. And my father, though, cried and said, what would you do if it was your son who dropped out of college, quit his job, donated his bank account, and got involved with a controversial movement? And I stopped and I thought about his pain, and I looked at it from his side, and I thought, oh, he thinks that I'm really brainwashed, but I know that I'm not. But I said, I think I would do what you're doing right now. I said, what do you want? He said, I just want you to talk to these ex-members, think about what they say, and if you want to go back, at least your mother and I will be able to sleep at night knowing we did the responsible thing. And I wanted to prove to them that I wasn't brainwashed in a cult. And fortunately, I woke up and I went, oh my God, yeah, because they were showing me Chinese communist brainwashing criteria, and they all fit the moon cult. And I started thinking again, and I realized I put all of my beliefs on the one belief that Moon was the Messiah. If I take out that he's a liar and he's not trustworthy, the whole thing collapses. And that was my straw that broke the camel's back, was realizing Moon was a liar and therefore not trustworthy, and therefore could not be a representative of God on earth, because the God I believed in was a God of truth.
And I think most people today are familiar with certain cults, Scientology, but I think in 2020, people have kind of forgot about the Moonies. Could you just kind of briefly, kind of go over the belief structure and kind of, that cult and what they represented?
Sure. So the Moonies were, as it turned out, after I got out of the cult, there was a congressional subcommittee investigation into Korean CIA activities in the United States, and the Moonies were named. And while I had been a leader and I gave over all these internal documents of Moon's speeches to the committee, I really didn't come to understand the true nature of how the Moonies came into existence until I read the entire congressional report, which was 11 volumes long. And I realized that back in the early 60s, there had been 2 coups in South Korea. North Korea is a political cult with brainwashing and still do their people. And the CIA thought, we need to set up a Korean CIA, and we need to set up a counter brainwashing program to stabilize South Korea. So they chose Moon, who had a small cult at the time, to be a front person to do this victory over communism indoctrination. And so it really was an outgrowth of MK Ultra and the whole war to find mind control that different state actors were trying to find. But essentially the theology is basically Moon and his third wife, Hak Jahan, were the true parents of humanity. They're sinless. Adam and Eve fell away from God because they had sex with, Eve got sexually seduced by Satan, and then she seduced Adam. So this blood lineage purification thing has to happen. And the Moonies got fame because Moon would do these mass weddings where members would be told who they're going to marry. They'd have 5 minutes to agree to God's choice for them. They would be all lined up, and I think he did 30,000 couples at one time in the stadium. So people have seen these images and they go, oh, that's crazy. That's obviously a cult. Yeah. But what they don't understand is how involved the Moonies have been and still are in politics, and particularly right-wing politics and anti-democratic notions. So as a Moon leader, I was told by Moon personally how democracy was satanic. He even said to a group of leaders, when we take power in America, we'll amend the Constitution and make it a capital offense for people to have sex outside of their unification designated marriages, which at the time I thought, what a great idea, because we need to save the world. We'll send people to the spirit world and we'll save them later. but
Right.
we'll take their physical bodies away from them so they don't interfere with our takeover of the world.
It's fascinating when I listen to you speak, because you know everybody knows cults exist. Like the cults are popular documentaries to watch. You know, the Scientology documentary is well known, and everybody knows they exist. But if you were to ask those people, does mind control exist? I don't think people grasp that mind control isn't just some Hollywood storyline. Mind control is a thing. So, two-part question: could you expand on that? And the second part, so much of your work and even getting your doctorate has been trying to improve the justice system's understanding of these things, because they have that same cluelessness that I just described. Can kind of expand on that for me.
Yeah, so words are the tools we use to think. And words like brainwashing have been used in so many different ways by so many different people that it can be pejorative, but it could be used in a flippant, positive way as well. And the same thing with mind control. So there's terms like thought reform, coercive control. Now, predatory alienation is a new term that we're trying to use. But undue influence is a very old term, hundreds of years old in British law, that basically describes someone exploiting someone else to take advantage of them.
Mm-hmm.
And the law, for the most part, looks at taking money or property away as the demonstration of mind control. And what I've come to understand, and what I did in my doctoral dissertation, is try to connect the dots with all these concepts. And most importantly, from the legal point of view, I'm bringing in trafficking, because sex trafficking and labor trafficking talks about fraud, force, and coercion. And it's inclusive in the same construct of essentially predator and prey.
Right.
You know, somebody's exploiting somebody else. And with the term cult, like I'm in the book, The Cult of Mac, for example. Cult of Mac, how were you in the book? Well, I was interviewed by the writer, and he said his editor needed to interview a cult expert, and I said, I'll do the interview, but I own several Macs, several iPhones, and I've only used Apple. I've never, used PCs. So what I'm trying to convey is the idea of a cult doesn't automatically, in my mind, mean a destructive cult or an authoritarian cult.
Right.
It just means you're passionately into something.
Yeah.
But the key is a benign cult or a productive cult is one that doesn't take away your human rights, where you have informed consent, you have freedom to leave, you have freedom to question, where you have your own autonomy, versus destructive authoritarian mind control, coercive control, undue influence, where you are pretty much made over in the cult's image or the cult leader's image. I talk about it almost like a cloning. Like I was told to be a small Sun Myung Moon, think like him, feel like him, walk like him, talk like him. So the notion in psychology, in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, DSM-5, the latest version, there's a section of a dissociative disorder that talks explicitly about cults and brainwashing and coercive persuasion. So the way I describe it is kind of like a dual identity. There was the real Steve Hassan and the Mooney Steve Hassan that suppressed the real Steve. And that when I was deprogrammed, I came back to the surface and went, wait, who is that? That was not my beliefs. I was doing things, throwing out my own poetry when I was a creative writer that believed that creativity was more important than anything else. How did he throw out the most important thing in his life? And it's, this was a creation of the authoritarian cult to make me dependent and obedient, to follow blindly and loyally. So what I come up with through a study of over 1,000 people is a construct that I refer to now as the bite model of authoritarian control. And it's changed from the bite model of mind control to authoritarian control, because essentially the definition of authoritarian is blind submission to an authority and suppression of your own thoughts and your own self-will. So the definition fits perfectly. And it also connects the dots with authoritarian regimes and political science spheres to a psychological notion of that there's an authoritarian who's taking over the real Steve.
Right, right. And there are, let's see if I can remember from your work, there are 5 different types of cults. There are religious cults, there are political cults, there are commercial cults, there are...
commercial cults, to interrupt you, is multi-level marketing groups or commercial cults. They're Enron. One of my colleagues did an article assessing Enron as a corporate cult.
Wow.
And then there's trafficking. That's a commercial cult too,
Wow.
right? And then there are one-on-one cults, cult of personality, where someone is completely dominated and controlled. And interestingly, in the United Kingdom, they actually passed a law where it's criminal for a man to control a woman.
Wow.
Coercively, to make that woman completely dependent, isolate her from her family and friends, take over her funds. There's a whole laundry list of criteria that men can be found guilty of. Unfortunately, it's not for women controlling men yet, and it's not expanded to incorporate organizations yet in the UK.
So you've studied cults, I mean, in and out, and as you're saying, all these different types of cults, sex trafficking. In your expert opinion, would you describe Trumpism and Donald Trump as a cult leader?
Yeah, absolutely. I wrote a book on it called The Cult of Trump, actually. So I guess I want to start by talking about the stereotypical profile of a cult leader, because I've been doing this work since 1976, so it's over 40 years. If you look at all the major cult leaders, they have this thing that Eric Fromm called malignant narcissism, which isn't just regular narcissism, but it's the antisocial attributes as well. So I just would like to take a minute and list them off, if I may. So the grandiose, self-centered behavior, the fantasies of power, success, and attractiveness, and these all fit Trump. And in chapter 3 of The Cult of Trump, I should say, I compare him with Jim Jones, Hubbard, and my former cult leader, Sun Myung Moon. But there are other cult leaders that fit it as well. So the grandiose, self-centered behavior, fantasies of power, success, and attractiveness, need for praise and admiration, the sense of entitlement, lack of empathy, which is huge, which means the inability to step into someone else's shoes and feel for them and feel sorry for them for whatever they've suffered. And this lack of empathy is what bullies, bullying is an expression of this in a very big way. Let's see, what else? Shaming, bullying, lack of remorse, thinking you're above the law, lying, pathological lying, interpersonally exploitative, sadistic, harassing and silencing, violence, paranoia, and inability to trust even your own family or friends. So what we have is a very dangerous profile of a figure that essentially harms anybody in their path. And women can be malignant narcissists too, by the way. But when you connect that profile to the office of the president and its incredible power and this demand for blind obedience and loyalty, you can look back at the Trump presidency and see he was just manifesting his own psychopathology. But let's talk why else I think Trumpism is a destructive authoritarian cult. So I have this model that was based on the work of Robert J. Lifton, who wrote one of the first books on brainwashing in China called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. Edgar Schein's book, Coercive Persuasion, Margaret Singer's model. So I have a model I call the BITE model, and it stands for Behavior, Information, Thoughts, and Emotional Control, BITE. Behavior control, information, thought, and emotional control. And I have lists of behaviors under each one of those things. And I did this study with over 1,000 participants, and we got an extremely high validation. And it wasn't surprising to me because people have been telling me for 30 plus years, the model helped save their life. It helped them get out of whatever cult they were in. So I already had qualitative validation for the model, but now we have quantitative validation that is able to say, here's a construct, the BITE model of authoritarian control, that can now be put into a legal construct of, let's look at the influencee and their vulnerabilities, the influencer or the predator or the predatory organization, and let's look how influence is being exerted to control their behavior, their information, their thoughts and emotions to make them dependent and obedient. So it's really a powerful potential tool for judges and juries to now, instead of saying, well, you were 18, you did it, you chose it.
Right.
Wait a minute, now we know there's something called hypnosis, and we now know that there's ways to hypnotize people covertly without them even realizing that they're being influenced. Let's look at that, because there are a lot of very good people who are being taken over in this way because they're watching hypnotic videos or they're going to meetings, etc. So, and I've been involved with a forensic think tank for the last 4 years at Harvard called the Program in Psychiatry and the Law. And I've been very much encouraged by the experts there, the psychiatrists, the psychologists, the attorneys, that the law really is out of date on understanding social psychology and how neuroscience functions, and in particular, the internet.
Well, that goes right into a phrase I think you coined. It's now your website URL, freedomofmind.org, and a title of a book. But this gets into freedom of mind. And in America, we love our freedom. The First Amendment protects speech, religion, press, assembly, and the right to petition your government. But we need to have freedom of mind. Kind of go into that and why you chose those words.
Sure. So my website is freedomofmind.com. I also have a nonprofit called freedomfromundueinfluence.org, which is what I'm using for my research. And I have a lot of other studies I feel need to be done to, again, bring science into this important area. I just lost my train of thought. What were you asking?
The phrase
freedom of mind, right.
Yeah.
So what I believe is that people, if they're adults, should be in control of their own minds and not controlled by someone else. So I talk about needing to be in the here and now, in your body, with an internal locus of control, not looking outside to some external authority figure. And using your critical thinking, using your intuition, using your heart, using your gut, and your network of trustworthy family and friends to reality test. And I basically take the position that if something is true, it will stand up to scrutiny. You should be able to question it, poke it, turn it over. And there really is something called facts. There really is something called gravity. You can believe that you can fly, but if you jump off the top of a skyscraper and you don't have a parachute, you're going to be dead. That is a fact. And I'm just so infuriated with the media when they say we're living in a post-truth world. I say nonsense. We're living in the age of influence, but truth is still truth. Facts are still facts. And that there is a very important function and beauty to the scientific method. And what is that? The scientific method assumes we don't have the truth with a capital T. It says we have a hypothesis for something, and then we have to test and see whether or not it's validated. And if we come up with a better hypothesis that we can validate, we abandon that and we use that. So, for example, people didn't think that ulcers were created by microorganisms. It was stress, but actually, no, it was demonstrated that with certain antibiotics, you can get rid of, the organisms that cause ulcers.
So we change our thesis.
Yeah, exactly. Now, when I was in the cult, the Moon cult, we were told that the divine principle, which was Moon's Bible, was the truth with a capital T. It was better than the Bible, that it unified science and religion. And in my mind, I believed it was the truth, and anything that disagreed with it was filtered out automatically. So whereas the scientific method is kind of going like this to keep taking in new information and expanding, when you're in a mind control cult, you're only looking to validate your beliefs. And over time, it gets more and more suffocating, for lack of a better term, and disconnected from what is real. And I really also want to comment, a very important social psychology principle is called the fundamental attribution error. And what that means is that the human beings have a bias towards overestimating a person's personality or disposition when they're trying to understand a behavior. They overestimate that, and they underestimate the context and the social influence variables. So in other words, why did Stephen get in the Moonies? He was weak, he was stupid, he was uneducated, he didn't come from a good family, he didn't have a good religious education, versus Steve was in a vulnerable moment in his life. He was situationally vulnerable because his girlfriend dumped him. Women were flirting with him, lying to him, and incrementally getting information from him and then using that information to indoctrinate him. And we see the same problem promulgated right now in America, where people are saying those Trump people are stupid.
Right.
They're ignorant, they're dumb, they're this, they're that. Instead of going, what media are they watching? What internet platforms are they inhabiting? Because when I go to those platforms, I can understand 100% how people can believe lies, because it's told in a very persuasive way.
Well, and that's something I kind of want to jump around to is, in our contemporary political discourse, I think we're all used to this just cacophonous argument all the time. And though you are classifying Trumpism as a cult, you're not doing it in a pejorative way. You do not want to demean Trump supporters. And that's something I just want to stress. If you go to Steve's Twitter and any of the things he's talked about, he never puts them down, because when you got out of a cult, it wasn't somebody shaming you. It was care and compassion. And kind of talk about that rub between classifying it as a cult, possibly upsetting the followers, but also being kind and compassionate towards them.
Yeah, it is my regret for agreeing with Simon & Schuster to do a book called The Cult of Trump, because I knew it would alienate people who were in the group, because I knew if there was a book, The Cult of Moon, and I was still in the Moonies, I would feel attacked and put down and shamed. And I'm actually talking with them. Can we put out another edition and change the title? because people really need the information that's in this book, and in terms of understanding any undue influence or mind control or authoritarian control situation.
I think it's a good title. It's hard to avoid that though, because it's kind of almost about empowering and educating everybody else, and if we could get everybody else on page, because it is a good title, because I think it is important to recognize that it is a cult.
It is. It's an authoritarian cult. It's not just a cult. And that was one of the other things. So when I did the book, I said, I don't think every cult is a bad thing. And let's look at the behaviors, and then we can see whether or not it supports human rights or not. I really believe in respectful, thoughtful interactions with people who've been influenced unduly, asking them good questions, waiting patiently for an answer, and realizing it was a process that was used on them over time to get them to believe those things. It's going to be a process over time to get people to change their beliefs on things. But there is an effect where prominent people who disavow will influence a lot of other people.
Correct.
And what's happening at the second, which may be time limited when Biden is inaugurated, but right now having not only attorneys general of several states saying the election was rigged and petitioning the Supreme Court, to say that it should be overturned, or having Republican politicians sign on to this, it gives an air of credibility to the believers.
Yeah, and
they shouldn't have, because it's not true.
And we'll get into specific strategies about interacting with someone from your family, but just as a broad overview, though many Trump supporters have some beliefs that most of us would regard as offensive, yelling at them is ineffective, is it not?
It's not only ineffective, it's counterproductive. It actually makes things worse. And one thing I've learned as a mental health professional is the rule is do no harm. So I say that for everybody. If you're going to say something and it's not going to make things better, why do you want to say it?
Right.
Why do you want to go there if you know it's going to polarize, it's going to make someone angry or upset or want to cut off from you? And that's another problem. I just want to say another big problem with people who are critics of Trump is the cancel culture and the blocking and muting and cutting off. And I'm all for protecting yourself from being abused. And I've had to do that with certain people who are just plain abusive and not just expressing a point of view. But I just really think that it's so critical to have humility, have patience, and have understanding that this is a man-made mental illness that's curable. Right. And there is a cure.
And with you, and I've noticed this was one of the first things that really drew me to you, was you've always had that compassion. And it's not just empty compassion. You're not allowing bad deeds to go unsaid, but you just realize, hey, this is ineffective. If we actually want to get this 74 million voters in the country, I mean, this is a big problem. How do we get them from point A to point B? And simply slamming them on Twitter is not only ineffective, but it might have the opposite effect. It might make more Trump supporters, right?
Exactly. No, exactly. So I've always taken the position with any person that I've been asked to help in any group. Hey, I'm a human being. I'm not perfect. I don't know everything. Maybe I'm missing something. Teach me, try to recruit me, help me understand. Yeah. And I often in that dialogue want to ask people to go back in time to when they first heard about Trump and what were their first impressions. And when I've been doing that with Trump supporters, it's amazing how few people have positive things to say when they think back to their first impressions of Trump.
Let's just go from the top. Okay. Let's say I have I have a friend right now who inspired this whole thing I'm doing, where his parents, they're very dear people, very Christian, and we'll get into that in a second because there are some Christian cults that intersect. We'll talk about that in a second. But I have someone I know in my life who is a Trump supporter. Everything devolves into an argument. How do I have a more productive conversation and possibly get them out of this closed mindset?
So I feel the most effective way to help people is through people who they know, family, friends, versus a media or a documentary. And it starts with reconnecting with who they were before they got into the cult. So if you used to go fishing with your friend, or you used to play volleyball or basketball, whatever, you want to start with reestablishing historical ties, emotional ties, share photos, videos, memories. And you can even agree not to talk politics.
Right.
Like, I miss you as a friend. Can we just put that aside and be in each other's lives again and talk about our kids, or talk about our girlfriends or boyfriends, whatever, as a foundation of rapport and trust building. And then you can begin a process of help me understand how you've come to this position.
And
like
let me quickly
persuaded
interject. Yeah.
you?
And help me understand is way different than look at this article. Help me understand is putting the onus on you that, hey, I don't understand. Can you explain?
100%. So I'm going to use a personal story, if I may, a brief one. My father, when I was deep in the Moon cult, read an article that the Moonies had an M16 gun factory in South Korea. My father called me on the phone and he said, "Steve, I hear that Moon has an M16 gun factory in Korea. What kind of messiah has a gun factory?"
Right.
Which caused me to start chanting in my mind, "Glory to heaven, peace on earth, crush Satan, crush Satan, crush Satan." I said, "We don't have a gun factory. Bye." I left that call angry, persecuted. Satan is controlling my parents, is what I was thinking as a good Moonie. I did go to my superior and I said, "Hey, my father said we have a gun factory. Do we have a gun factory?" "No."
Done.
Right? And my father never followed up. But I give this story. If my father had said to me, "Hey, Steve, I have a problem. Can you help?"
Oh,
I would say, "What's up, Dad?"
Yeah.
"Oh, the neighbor, the neighbor down the block read this article about how Moon had an M16 gun factory.
Yes.
What kind of messiah has an M16 gun factory?" I didn't know how to answer him.
Is that true?
Yeah. What do I say? I would have said, "Oh, we don't have a gun factory, but let me check."
Right.
So then I would ask, "We don't have a gun factory." Then I'd call back my father and say, "Hey, we don't have a gun factory." And then my father could do a follow-up and say, "Oh, so that means that the group can sue the Washington Post," which is what I think who wrote that article, for lying, because it's defamation.
Right.
Are they going to do that? And then I'd have to go back to my leader and go, "Are we suing the Washington Post?"
Right.
Then I'd want to see the article.
Of course.
Right? But it would be my father's asking for my help instead of attack.
Yeah, and I think a lot about Mark Bunker, who you know. Mark Bunker was a guy I used to watch online, and he was this Scientology activist, like anti-Scientology activist. But he was such a sweetheart. He would go to these Scientologists and like be very cordial and kind, and he never said, "You're stupid." And kind of a thing that I've kind of taken on now from Mark and you is, I don't hate Trump supporters. I hate Trumpism.
Yes. I hate Trumpism too, and I don't. You make the distinction between the person and the behavior, or the group that's negatively influencing them.
So,
I love Russians. I just don't like Putin and his authoritarian control.
Right. And again, looking at people as kind of like prey of these techniques. I mean, you started this earlier, but we are living in the age of influence. I mean, older propaganda models are nothing compared to internet algorithms.
Yep.
And so, okay,
When you say internet algorithms, I want to just do a mention of 3 critical documentaries I think everyone needs to watch: The Great Hack, The Social Dilemma, and People You May Know.
Oh, People You May Know.
That's on Amazon. I did a blog on the 3 of them, but essentially The Great Hack was about how Cambridge Analytica and the Mercers illegally took all kinds of personal data from Americans to use that data, every like you did, every dislike you did, what sites you visited. And they were evolving a profile, and that, to my understanding, now there are 5,000 data points for every voting American.
Wow.
That's on the dark web. So they know who your friends are. They know if you've gone to a website saying, what do I do if I'm depressed, or how do I help a friend who's suicidal? They have all of those data points. And so, and now there are groups that are organizing this information and selling this information to cults to recruit people into churches and other groups. So what we now have with cell phones and platforms is 21st century undue influence or mind control that's being exerted on people.
Just as a side note, when you were talking earlier, I was thinking about this too, but doesn't it bother you that, and it interjects with Trumpism, but conspiracy theorists, there are conspiracies in plain sight, like what you're describing, yet they get involved in these completely bizarre ones. Does that annoy you?
The whole thing is kind of frustrating, honestly, because I've done hundreds of interviews. I've written 4 books. I'm not the only person who's an ex-member, who's an authority on destructive mind control cults. But there is such resistance in the media and in politicians, etc., to the notion that people can be influenced unethically. So I'm more frustrated with the media. I'm frustrated with people who have philanthropic foundations who say they want democracy, and they haven't done their homework on the basics. They're not seeing the dots connecting of, this is about an evolution of psychology and neuroscience connected to the, algorithms and the internet, where people can be manipulated and controlled.
Yeah.
And what was so fascinating for me to watch in The Social Dilemma was listening to these former executives from Facebook and Twitter and Instagram talking about how the AI algorithms are what's running things. You can dial up, more attention, more money. You can dial it down, but the algorithms are taking over.
Yeah.
And we're losing to the point where they won't let their own family and their own children be on the internet, right? But they're saying, it makes money and it helps some people. I'm going to not own up to the ethical and moral consequences of what I've done here.
Let's go back again to kind of like how to help someone out of the cult of Trump. And there's one we forgot to mention. When I was working for you, you always talked about this, and I kind of didn't think about it until recently. But the first step is educating yourself. And as a side note, everyone read this book, Steve's book. This is his first book, Combating Cult Mind Control. Get the one with 1 T that has this design on Amazon. But this tells this whole story. But you need to start with yourself, because if you don't understand these concepts, you can't help them. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
No, 100%. So my book first came out in 1988, and it really was out of date for many, many decades. And I finally bought the rights back and put it out with 1 T. But if you want to influence somebody, do it from a position of knowledge and awareness. And again, I always take the position of, hey, if I'm missing something or if I don't understand, teach me. I'm open to it. And having that attitude, I learn a lot of new things that are really, really valuable, instead of being, taking the other position of, I know it all, I'm the expert, you should just, blindly listen to me. No, this is a community effort. here.
And it stops you. It's funny, like, and it's you've been so kind with me, because I have like the little devil sometimes and the little angel, where I will get what you're saying. And this is why I'm creating the show, because I want to start taking the higher road. I will know that, like, I need to be patient with people, but then sometimes I'll just get so angry, like so many of us, and I'll lash out and be mean to people online. And I know it's not productive. But the good thing about the education piece is that when you do that, you kind of change that initial response that you have, so you don't get initially triggered, and then you don't lash out, and then it's so much better to do that. Okay, so educating yourself first, building rapport with someone, and that's mental health 101. When I used to work with kids with autism, they would say for the first 2 weeks, don't do any work, just get them to like you and hang out with them. So building rapport, and then what did you say the next steps were?
Asking questions and learning about how they make sense of reality. And in particular, this dual identity notion, before they got into the cult, what were they interested in?
Yeah.
What were their values? What did they like to do? Are they doing those things now? If not, why not?
Right.
You know, Steve, you were a creative writing major. You wrote poetry. When was the last time you wrote a poem?
Wow.
How come you're not writing? You loved poetry, don't you?
Right. And it's even important, you talk about this with your, you leaving the cult, but it's really important to take a back door. If you come out right away with all the stuff Donald Trump did, people are going to be like, just, rule you out. But if you start with communist China, like these back doors, and then make the parallels between the things they're doing in communist China, they might have some epiphanies. Is that correct?
100%. So my experience is, when you're in a mind control cult, an authoritarian cult, you don't think you are. You think you've made your own decisions, but you're very aware other groups are bad. Right. So what I say strategically, and this is a paradigm shift that I have to teach my clients, the ones that ask me for my help, I have to teach them to think, instead of just saying whatever comes into your head, think strategically, right? Understand the dual identity. You want to empower the real self, and you want to get the cult self questioning. So everything has to be thought through in terms of that paradigm. But that ultimately it's the real person who's your best ally, because that's what I realized. And it was years after my deprogramming, but I realized what was working in my deprogramming was I was telling them what I agreed with, what I didn't agree with, what made sense, what didn't. And they were listening and going, Steve was a Jew. We should not emphasize Jesus in the time we're doing. And I was programmed as a Moonie to hate communism because it was Satan's army. So when they said, are you willing to learn about Chinese communist brainwashing? I was like, yeah, please. Yeah, yes. Yeah. So then we're reading, and they were having me read the words of this, psychiatrist, military intelligence researcher, milieu control or loaded language or cult of confession. And I'm reading them, and the ex-Moonies are going, I'd like to share a story that fits this one. And I found myself listening to them and going, I have much better ones than that. Yes. But I wouldn't verbalize it, but I started thinking about it, to the point where we went through all 8 criteria, and I was like, that's really weird, because we're God, communism is Satan, but we do the same techniques of brainwashing. That wasn't the straw that broke the camel's back in my mind, though. It was really about realizing that I couldn't trust Moon. Because they asked me to read one of Moon's own speeches printed by the group about how much he respected and loved Americans, and how he was surprised of accusations that a Korean could brainwash an American. Right. And I had experienced 100 times at least where in person Moon talked about how Americans were stupid idiots and he needed to brainwash their minds because they were so pathetic. So I had this dissonance of what Moon said to me personally in person and this, and I went, that's a lie. And once it became conscious, I was like,
Uh-oh.
If he's a liar, I can't trust him. We're teaching a God of truth. How could he be an agent of God if he's a liar?
Right.
And I had this subjective experience, like a house of cards going plop, 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 because it was all built around this notion that God had chosen him to save humanity.
Wow. And I
And
love
that's what a
you,
lot
yeah,
of Trump believers are believing right now, is that God has chosen Trump to
right.
save humanity from this Illuminati pedophile cult.
Oh, we'll get into that in a second, but yeah, just one last thing on that. It's like choosing a frame that matters to that person. So one of the things I did when I would connect to my inner Steve Hassan and do it the right way is I talk to somebody, and my girlfriend always gives me a hard time because if we go to a bar and see a Trump supporter, I'm like, yes, I want to talk to him, and it's always cordial, but they hate the Democrats, and I'm a progressive guy, so I can relate to a lot of that. So I'll be like, hey, did you hear about this one Democratic politician who hired her family and they paid them so much money? But then my step two isn't, that's what Trump does. It's just, you want them to connect the dots. It's almost like
Exactly.
setting up these whole things. Oh, you don't like corruption, and finding frames that matter to that person. Like you
Exactly.
can't, if you have a person that doesn't really care about guns, you're not going to talk about the NRA as much because they don't care about it. What issues are important to them? And then take the back door, show them maybe some Democrats that did the thing Trump did, but then have them connect those dots, right?
100%. And it's really about empowering the person to think for themselves instead of telling them what to think or trying to, pull apart that their belief systems are wrong.
And the thing that I've learned from you and a few others is it's not, I mean, you described a house of cards, but that's a gradual process. It's about planting little seeds, and hopefully when they're alone thinking to themselves, they have those epiphanies.
100%. I do very extensive backgrounds on people, on families contact me. I want to know, who they were before, etc. But I'm almost never able to predict 100% what's going to help them get out. So I just have to keep remembering, if we have rapport and trust and we're asking questions, we're going to hear from them when the right time is, what the right issue is. We want to just be able to take advantage of it.
Right.
I'll also add one other thing that's very
please.
fair, along the lines of, hey, convert me. If it's so obvious to you, bring it on. And they'll say, watch this documentary or watch this thing. And you say, I'll make a deal with you. Let's trade. Let's be reciprocal. Right. I'll watch one of yours, you watch one of mine, but we have to agree that we're going to talk about each one and really dissect it.
Right. I mean, there's just so much wrong. It's so crazy to me as I've really dug into this, like how wrong are we do it? Debates don't work. Giving somebody more facts doesn't work. It's trying to get in touch with their beliefs. And I love even how you framed your questions. Hey, explain to me. Putting the onus on you. Hey, I don't quite understand this. Can you explain blank? And making them have those epiphanies themselves.
Yeah, and I frequently was having Trump supporters accuse me of being brainwashed by the liberal media and in the cult of Soros. And instead of going, oh, don't be ridiculous, I'm a cult expert, you need to trust me, I'd say, oh, really? Help explain to me what brainwashing is.
Right.
What am I missing?
Right. And that even, oh, that's so brilliant. I've been practicing some of this stuff online, and a lot of times people won't respond to you. But when you deviate from that corny Facebook argument thing that all of us have seen, and you first of all establish rapport. First of all, if you don't have a reactionary response, that alone is revolutionary, and that'll change their views on liberals or whatever you call yourself, that you're not just like getting triggered and you're the safe space college kid. You're being patient, but yeah.
So part of the thing, you really hit the nail on the head, is people need to develop a sense of resourcefulness. and self-awareness of when they're getting triggered or when they're losing their patience, and understand it's better to exit than lose it and then have to repair, what you say or do. And ultimately, I say truth will stand up to scrutiny. And if it doesn't, the burden is on the person who says the most extraordinary thing to prove it with extraordinary proof. And the burden isn't on us to disprove it.
Right.
So you say that Trump won the election. Let me see the proof.
Right.
Show me the evidence. Oh, they found 300, ballots in a garbage can. Okay, but how will 300 ballots influence 306 electoral college votes and 7 million popular votes?
Right. Exactly. Yeah, I've been doing a thing when I've been talking to people now. Hey, can you explain? Okay, you think there's election fraud? Cool. Can you? And again, you're never validating their claim. You're just saying, okay, I understand what you're saying. And again, this is a lot of reflexive listening. So a lot of these skills, correct me if I'm wrong, are like what people would advise in marriage counseling situations. I hear you saying, are you saying? Okay, cool. Because even that, when people feel heard, that they hear you saying, representing their view with justice, that already is going to open them up. A lot of I feel statements, but yeah. Sorry, I kind of cut you off there.
No, so I'm going to need to go, unfortunately. So I suspect we didn't get through a lot of your questions.
Oh, we did. No, we actually did.
If you want, we can try to schedule another time if there's anything urgent.
We're going to have to, because you are a revelation. But yes, thank you so much for talking to me. Again, my 2 recommendations to everybody sitting here. I would start with this. You would recommend that too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then freedom of mind, and then the cult of Trump, actually.
But the cult of Trump, for everybody, so many of the things that we just talked about today, he really gets into, I have a lot of bookmarks there, so if you can see all those. He goes through the typical profile of the cult leader, but then he also talks about the media and how it's just kind of the perfect petri dish for all of this right now.
Yeah, so what I've learned is that there's been decades of very intentional behaviors, like, for example, from the Coke industry people who have a lot of fossil fuels and don't like government regulation. They're going to be fined millions for poisoning the environment, or for not paying the Indians that they were pumping oil off their property. They're spending a lot of money promulgating climate change as a hoax, when in fact it's overwhelmingly scientifically proven, and people have their own experiences of global climate change as well. And this Council of National Policy, which I did not know about when I wrote The Cult of Trump, but I have since read The Shadow Network by Ann Nelson. These are people who've been working for decades using 4th generation warfare, putting people into state legislatures in order to influence, buying up media entities in order to promulgate. I really believe that we are going to need to regulate communication again, because the fairness doctrine should not be applied to something that isn't factually true. Just say, oh, we need to hear the other side.
Right.
We need to hear from the Moonies saying, nope, Sun Myung Moon's the greatest man in human history.
Right.
No, we don't need to hear that, because there's no proof that that's true.
Yeah, and that's a whole discussion we'll have next time, that gets into freedom of speech, so people get very triggered with that, but the internet is a beast that nobody thought about when they were conceiving of that.
Right, but the rule of law is still that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater if there's no fire, because people can get hurt. And that same thinking is true about people being hurt by public figures and saying violent things. Someone should be strung up, somebody should be shot, etc. That should be a crime.
So everyone go to freedomofmind.com. I said .org earlier. That was wrong. Freedomofmind.com. Again, The Cult of Trump, the book, Combating Cult Mind Control, Freedom of Mind. Again, these are not just empty plugs. I've read them all, and they're mind-blowingly good. Steve is on Twitter at Cult Expert. And any other closing thoughts, Steve?
Well, I just wish there were more people like you, Dan, who care deeply, passionately, an activist, an idealist who wants to believe in human rights and saving our country. And we really need to recruit kind of an army of people like yourself and myself who want to defend a democracy.
Thank you so much, Steve. Always an honor to talk to you, and we will connect soon.